I stood in the kitchen, the bowl of hot soup just hitting the floor, and my son, the boy I spent my life raising, was looking at me with those cold eyes. "What the hell do you think you're doing, no salt?" The slap didn't hurt as much as the way it shattered my heart. All I wanted to ask was what happened to my son. My name is Eleanor Vance, and I'm 62 years old, or at least I was when this nightmare started. I live in a quiet, well-kept suburb of Dallas, the kind of neighborhood where everyone waves and pretends they don't know your business. I was a CPA for 30 years before retiring, always meticulous, always in control. My life revolved around structure, routine, and taking care of my family. My husband passed away 5 years ago, leaving me with the house, a healthy investment portfolio, and the belief that my biggest challenge would be deciding on my next cruise destination. Then there's Daniel, my son. He's 35, a successful financial analyst, and everything I thought a good son should be until he met Sarah. Sarah, my daughter-in-law, is a sharp younger woman, a social media consultant. When they got married 3 years ago, I welcomed her with open arms. I saw her as the daughter I never had. We shared recipes, shopping trips, and she seemed to genuinely appreciate the stability and comfort I provided, especially since they moved into the guest wing of my large home to save money for a down payment. They were supposed to be the perfect young couple, and I the supportive, doting mother-in-law. But I was wrong. The roles shifted. The love turned into an expectation of service, and the respect I once commanded simply vanished. I wasn't Eleanor Vance, the successful former CPA. I was just Mom, the live-in cook and cleaner. And this little incident over a bowl of soup, that was the day I realized I was living with strangers, not family. People look at me and see a strong, slightly stern woman who has her life together. But beneath this tailored exterior lies a raw vulnerability that few ever see. My fear isn't of being alone. It's of being unnecessary and unloved by the one person I sacrificed everything for. My childhood was marked by abandonment. My father left when I was 7, and my mother, devastated and overworked, often looked at me as a burden, not a blessing. I learned early on that love was conditional, tied to my usefulness. I became the perfect child, top grades, silent, helpful. I vowed that when I had my own family, I would create an unbreakable bond, a sanctuary where my children would always feel loved and safe. Daniel was that hope. I poured every ounce of my emotional energy and financial resource into him. He was my purpose. This history makes me hypersensitive to rejection or disrespect. A sharp tone and eye roll, or a forgotten thank you, doesn't just register as rudeness. It registers as a confirmation of my deepest, oldest fear that I am being cast aside, just as my father cast aside my mother and me. My physical mannerisms often betray this insecurity. I maintain a stiff posture, my face often set in a meticulous, slightly worried expression, trying to project control. But my eyes, they are the giveaway. They constantly dart, searching the faces of Daniel and Sarah for any sign of disapproval or warmth. When I feel stressed, my hands clench tightly at my sides, little fists hidden by the fabric of my dress, a physical attempt to brace myself against an invisible blow. If I perceive a slight, my body subtly recoils, pulling my shoulders inward, making me look smaller, more defensive. This whole incident with the soup, it wasn't about the salt. It was about Daniel's face, cold and dismissive, and my hands started shaking uncontrollably. That look, that lack of care in his expression, immediately took me back to my childhood feeling worthless. It instantly confirmed my deepest insecurity. I was no longer Mom. I was just an obstacle, easily dismissed. Before the catastrophic soup incident, our relationship, the male-deal dynamic, operated under a deceptive layer of pleasant, almost aggressively cheerful compliance. From the outside, anyone observing us would see a loving, multi-generational household thriving. This was the facade I meticulously maintained, and that Sarah seemed to skillfully exploit. Every morning, the tone was set with an overly bright, jovial exchange. Sarah would come downstairs often in designer athleisure wear and greet me with a loud, "Good morning, Eleanor. You look absolutely radiant," a compliment that always felt slightly off-key, too performative. I, in turn, would respond with a warm, "Thank you, dear. I've made your favorite lemon scones," offering a gesture of service to ensure harmony. The emotional atmosphere was one of forced, lightweight joy. We'd sit together for coffee. The conversation would be easy, light, and focused purely on neutral topics, work, gossip, TV shows, or planning the next weekend's gardening. There was an unspoken rule: we avoided anything deep emotional or confrontational. If a minor issue arose, say Sarah leaving her workout clothes draped over the dining chair, I would address it with a soft, "Oh honey, can we just tuck these away? Don't want them getting wrinkled?" accompanied by a slight, reassuring smile on my face. The interaction was always gentle and accommodating on my part. I felt like I was constantly tiptoeing around their needs, offering help before it was even asked. My hands were always busy ironing Daniel's shirts, prepping complex dinners, polishing the silver. All these small, repeated acts of service were my way of buying their affection and, more importantly, securing my place in their lives. My eyes would often follow their movements with a sort of hopeful curiosity, seeking validation in their satisfied expressions after a meal or their relaxed demeanor in the evening. It was a relationship built on superficial, good feelings. Sarah would occasionally give me a light, warm hug, and Daniel would give me a quick pat on the shoulder, often saying, "Thanks, Mom, you're the best." It was all very hooray, very lighthearted. I mistook this superficial happiness for deep connection. I believed that as long as I kept providing comfort, ease, and a high standard of living, this lightness would continue, and I would finally have the secure, loving family I always craved. I was blissfully, terribly unaware that this very pattern of overgiving was setting the stage for my ultimate downfall, turning me from a mother into a maid, ripe for disrespect. The shift from the manufactured, joyful setup to raw conflict was sudden, like a curtain dropping on a bad play. It happened on a Tuesday, usually a quiet night. I had spent hours preparing a sophisticated meal: roasted chicken, perfectly sautéed asparagus, and a creamy Hungarian mushroom soup, Daniel's childhood favorite. My focus was on creating perfection. Every detail was an act of love. We sat down, the three of us. The first sign of trouble wasn't a word, but Daniel's facial expression. As he took the first spoonful of soup, his face didn't register satisfaction. It pinched slightly. His eyes, which usually held a soft familiarity, went cold and analytical. It was the look he gave a spreadsheet with incorrect figures. "Mom," he started, his voice flat. "This is bland. There's no salt in this." I felt an immediate sharp pang of inadequacy. My stomach clenched. "Oh, darling, I'm so sorry. I must have forgotten the final pinch." The cream must have muted it. "Let me get the shaker." I started to reach across the table, my hand trembling slightly, eager to fix the mistake, to restore the harmony. But Sarah cut in, her tone dripping with what sounded like feigned concern, but felt like pure mockery. "Eleanor, really? It's mushroom soup, not rocket science. After all the cooking you do, how do you forget the basics?" She didn't look at me. She was busy rolling her eyes toward Daniel, a clear signal of solidarity with him against me. The sight of their synchronized disapproval, that shared expression of judgment, amplified my old fears. I felt my chest tighten, a sensation of being scrutinized and found wanting. I wasn't just a mother who forgot salt. I was a failure. Then Daniel slammed his spoon down. The sound echoed in the dining room. His face flushed, and his body language became aggressively rigid. "Forget the shaker, Mom. This is dinner. You serve bland food. I've had a 10-hour day, and I come home to this." The sheer disproportionate anger over salt was what struck me. It wasn't about the food. It was about control and the realization that his fatigue and frustration were being directed entirely at me. My expression must have been one of shock and hurt. I remember my bottom lip quivering slightly, a childhood habit resurfacing. When I tried to gently defend myself, "Daniel, please, it's just a mistake, don't yell at me." He didn't just yell. He stood up towering over me. His hand swept the bowl of soup off the table. It hit the floor with a sickening crash, splattering cream and mushrooms everywhere. The physical act of violence, the sheer disrespect of destroying what I'd carefully prepared, was the final devastating blow. As the hot liquid splashed my dress, Daniel loomed, his eyes burning into mine, and he spat. "Don't tell me what to do." "Mom, fix it." That was when he backhanded me. It was quick, startling, and completely unexpected. The pain was immediate, but the emotional impact was crushing. My body instinctively drew back, my hands flying to my cheek, less to soothe the sting and more to confirm the reality of the assault. I was staring up at my son, the person I cherished, seeing a stranger, a cruel, entitled man. In that moment, my perception wasn't just hurt. It was a terrifying clarity. They saw me as an object to be commanded and abused, not a person to be loved. This wasn't just a miscommunication. This was an act of brutal domination. The moment the force of his hand connected with my cheek, time seemed to dissolve. The ringing in my ears muffled the sound of the glass shattering and Sarah's sharp intake of breath. This wasn't just a physical shock. It was the total implosion of my life's narrative. I wasn't just wronged. I was betrayed at the most fundamental level by the one person I thought was my anchor. I stood there immobilized. My facial expression was initially frozen, a mask of profound disbelieving horror. I didn't cry immediately. Instead, my eyes, wide and fixed on Daniel, slowly registered the brutal reality. I saw not remorse, but a flash of something chillingly close to indifference on his face as he looked at the mess he'd made and the mother he'd struck. "Daniel," I whispered, the sound hoarse, barely audible. My body was trembling, but not from fear. It was a seismic shift of recognition. For 35 years, I had poured love, money, and sacrifice into this man, building him up, fearing his rejection. And in one brutal second, he destroyed the very foundation of my devotion over a seasoning mistake. Sarah rushed over, not to me, but to Daniel. Her expression shifted instantly from surprise to a calculated distress. "Oh my God, Daniel, look what you did. You can't just lose it like that," she exclaimed. But her hands were already on his arm, steering him away, making it look like she was the peacemaker, and he was the victim of his own temper. That's when the emotional explosion happened. It wasn't loud. It was an internal detonation that radiated outward. My internal voice screamed, "No more." My years of feeling unloved, of desperately seeking validation, culminated in a surge of incandescent rage and absolute clarity. The fear that had always dictated my actions, the fear of being alone and unneeded, was instantly overshadowed by the burning realization that I was already alone and being actively abused. My hands, which had been clutching my stinging cheek, slowly dropped to my sides. I straightened my posture, lifting my chin. The hurt on my face hardened into cold resolve. My eyes lost their fearful darting and fixed on Daniel with an unwavering, terrifying intensity. "Get out," I said, my voice steady, low, and completely devoid of emotion. Daniel paused, taken aback by the shift in my tone. "What?" he asked, his confusion clear on his face. I said, "Get out of my house," I repeated, enunciating every word. I moved deliberately, taking one slow step toward them. My body language was no longer defensive. It was threatening. My gaze didn't waver. "You don't hit your mother. You don't destroy my property. You don't disrespect me in my own home. This is over. Now, tonight." In that moment, standing amid the wreckage of the soup and the wreckage of our relationship, I was no longer the subservient mother-in-law. I was Eleanor Vance, the successful former CPA, the owner of the house, and the custodian of her own self-respect. The terror was gone, replaced by a fierce protective fire. This was the moment I stopped catering to their comfort and started fighting for my survival. The deep-seated emotions were no longer fear and inadequacy, but a potent mix of righteous anger and a devastating grief for the son I had lost. The line had been crossed, and there was no going back. The shock of the physical assault fueled an immediate and calculated response. I bypassed the emotional grief and switched into full CPA mode, methodical, strategic, and ruthless. My goal was not just to remove them, but to establish an undeniable legal and financial fortress around myself. This was about justice building. First action: cutting the financial leash. The morning after the incident, before Daniel or Sarah were awake, I was already on the phone. My first call was to my personal banker. They were living in my guest wing, rent-free, with me covering all utilities and grocery bills, a substantial monthly cost. I instructed the bank to immediately change all automated payments for the household to a separate account, accessible only by me, and to freeze the joint-use debit card I had foolishly given Daniel for household emergencies. I changed the Wi-Fi password and disabled access to the smart home features they had grown accustomed to controlling. The feeling I got was one of intense, focused determination. My face was calm, but my eyes were steely. This was a necessary surgery. Second action: securing the territory. Next, I called a locksmith and an advanced security system installer. By 10 a.m., 2 things were done. All exterior locks were rekeyed, and the main entrance code was changed. More critically, I had high-definition security cameras, both audible and visible, installed in all common areas, including the dining room where the assault took place, the kitchen, and the shared hallway. I gave the locksmith a note: only give the new key to Eleanor Vance. When the security technician finished, I looked at the monitor grid. A profound sense of relief washed over me, replaced quickly by a quiet satisfaction. Now, if Daniel or Sarah tried anything, there would be an indisputable record. This created a sense of tension and suspense. The audience knows the drama is about to escalate. Third action: legal consultation and evidence gathering. My third call was to my late husband's attorney, a specialist in estate and domestic issues. I met him that afternoon. I presented him with the facts, the witnesses, none except the mess, and my intention of formal immediate eviction notice and a restraining order based on the physical assault. While waiting for the official paperwork, I meticulously documented the physical evidence. I took close-up time-stamped photos of the bruise on my cheek, the remains of the soup splattered on the wall, and the dent in the antique hutch where the bowl had struck. My hands were steady as I typed out a detailed, factual account of the previous night's events, creating a legal narrative. There was no room for emotion in the documentation. It had to be clinical. Yet underneath, a powerful, almost joyful sense of reclaiming power surged. I was no longer the victim. I was the prosecutor. When Daniel and Sarah arrived home that evening, finding the new locks, the disabled Wi-Fi, and the dark silence, the tension was palpable. Daniel's face went from confused to furious, his body rigid with entitlement. Sarah's expression was a mix of calculated concern and sudden panic. I met them in the living room holding the sealed envelope. My emotion was one of quiet, dignified authority, an almost eerie calmness. I handed the envelope to Daniel. You have 30 days to vacate. The financial support is terminated immediately. Any attempt to contact me or enter my private area will be documented and reported to the police and my lawyer. My goal was achieved. The audience feels the justice building as I completely flip the power dynamic, leaving them in bewildered outrage, setting the stage for their inevitable counterattack. The hilarity lay in their sheer shock, that their doormat of a mother had suddenly turned into a granite wall. The eviction notice delivered with such cold precision didn't lead to compliance. It led to immediate intense retaliation, exactly as my lawyer had warned. Their entitlement knew no bounds, and their emotion quickly escalated from shock to bitter resentment. The very next day, Daniel stormed into the house. He had managed to figure out the old backdoor code before I disabled it. His face contorted with a fury that was frighteningly familiar. "You can't do this. Mom, this is ridiculous. You hit yourself. You're clearly having some kind of senior episode." This was their strategy: gaslighting and questioning my sanity. Sarah, standing slightly behind him, played the role of the tearful, concerned observer. Her expression was one of deep, sorrowful concern, but her eyes were calculating and cold. "Eleanor, please, we're worried about you. Maybe you should talk to someone. This erratic behavior, it's not you." Their counterattack was multi-pronged and designed for maximum emotional and legal damage. 1. Calling authorities and alleging abuse. Daniel actually called the police's non-emergency line, claiming I was experiencing a severe mental breakdown, had become physically aggressive, and needed evaluation. He framed the bruise on my cheek, the one he inflicted as a self-injury resulting from my instability. The police came, and the sheer audacity made my hands clench. My body language remained calm, however. I presented the officer with the detailed documentation and showed the newly installed security cameras. This step immediately planted the seed of doubt about who the true victim was. 2. Seeking financial control. Sarah contacted my lawyer's office, attempting to file a spurious petition claiming that Daniel, as my only son, should be granted power of attorney, citing my recent erratic, dangerous financial decisions, i.e., cutting off their money. Her thoughts were clearly visible in her demeanor. She believed she deserved my wealth and saw my independence as a barrier. The audience is meant to feel intense anger and revulsion toward this cynical grab for control. 3. Calling a psychiatrist. The most insidious move was when Sarah subtly encouraged a friend, a clinical social worker, to visit me under the guise of concern, essentially trying to get a professional to declare me incompetent. The woman arrived, and Sarah was effusively happy, believing her plan was working. I met the social worker with controlled dignity and a prepared statement regarding my financial solvency and my complete understanding of my legal actions, making sure to highlight the recent police visit and the installed cameras. The internal conflict was intense. I wanted to scream, to lash out at their cruel manipulation, but I held back, transforming the hatred and the deep sense of betrayal into sharp focus. Their faces, filled with their own self-pity and entitlement, only strengthened my resolve. The climax was reached. They had escalated the conflict from a domestic dispute to a full-blown psychological and legal war. The audience is now gripped by the sheer audacity of the villainy, creating maximum retention and a burning desire for the final strike. The climax of their audacious counterattack only provided me with the perfect opening for the final decisive strike. They had brought the battle into the legal and public arena, and Eleanor Vance was far more prepared for that fight than they could ever imagine. My lawyer, Mr. Harrison, arranged a mandatory mediation meeting, a structured environment where I knew they would overplay their hand. Daniel and Sarah walked in, radiating self-pity. Daniel's face was still set in a perpetually aggrieved sulk, while Sarah maintained her facade of the worried, long-suffering daughter-in-law. Her hands were clasped together, suggesting innocence and vulnerability. I walked in with Mr. Harrison, projecting an aura of unflappable calm. My body was upright and steady. My eyes met theirs only briefly, just enough to convey that I was no longer their mother. I was their opponent. Mr. Harrison began by calmly addressing their claims of my erratic behavior and the demand for power of attorney. He didn't argue. He presented facts. He introduced two key figures. First, my longtime financial advisor, who testified to my complete mental acuity and flawless management of my substantial estate. This instantly invalidated Sarah's financial competency claims. Second, he brought in Mrs. Rodriguez, my neighbor who had been painting her fence next door on the day of the soup incident. She provided her statement. She had clearly heard the shouting, the distinct crash, and Daniel's menacing voice, and then the sound of me crying out after the impact. Her testimony as an objective third party severely damaged Daniel's claim that I had self-harmed. The sense of satisfaction began to build. The true turning point came when Mr. Harrison, with a calm authority, introduced the Exhibit A security footage. He played the clip from the new dining room camera. The video was chillingly clear. Daniel slamming the spoon, his furious expression, his hand sweeping the bowl, and the subsequent moment of his aggression, and the backhand slap. The sound was loud and undeniable. It captured Sarah's immediate calculated reaction, not tending to me, but pulling Daniel away, and then looking around searching for potential witnesses before starting her performance. As the footage played, Daniel's face drained of color, his initial shock morphing into a desperate trapped fury. Sarah's composure completely shattered. Her mouth fell open, and her feigned sympathy dissolved into raw panic. Her hands flew to her face in a desperate gesture not of sorrow, but of being caught. When the lights came up, the air was thick with their failure. My lawyer didn't need to say much more. He simply reiterated the terms of the eviction notice and the restraining order based on the physical assault documented on film. The truth was fully exposed. Their calculated cruelty was laid bare for everyone, including the mediator, to see. The audience feels the surge of triumph, the moment of complete and utter vindication. The mediation session ended swiftly and decisively in my favor. The undeniable video evidence and the supporting testimony obliterated their manipulative narrative. They had tried to paint me as the unstable aging parent, but the truth revealed them as entitled abusers trying to plunder an elderly woman's security. The victory and the silence. The final court order confirmed the eviction and established a strict permanent restraining order against both Daniel and Sarah. The moment the judge's gavel hit the block, a wave of profound, exquisite relief washed over me. It wasn't the relief of a battle won, but the liberation from a cage I hadn't realized I was trapped in. I walked out of the courtroom with Mr. Harrison, the tension that had been lodged in my neck and shoulders for years finally melting away. Daniel and Sarah were there, their faces etched with resentment and defeat. They were forced to pack their meager belongings and vacate my property within 72 hours. When I returned home, the guest wing was empty. The silence in the house was immense, restorative, and absolutely precious. Reclaiming my life. The emotional core of this victory wasn't financial. It was the recovery of my personal sovereignty. I had protected my right to freedom and security. I changed the house back to my house. I redecorated the guest wing, turning it into a beautiful sunlit studio for my painting hobby, a passion I had abandoned to cook and clean for them. This victory was bittersweet, marked by a deep sense of grief for the son I thought I had raised. The betrayal was a gaping wound. How could the boy I read bedtime stories to, the one I paid for college and supported through tough times, be capable of such callousness? My expression often shifted between a satisfied smile of independence and a deep, sorrowful frown. I felt the sharp, aching sadness that comes from realizing the love you gave was returned with entitlement and violence. But that sadness was quickly replaced by a fierce sense of worthiness. I had stood up for myself. I had protected the integrity of my own life. I was not just a mother. I was Eleanor Vance, a woman who deserved respect, safety, and happiness. I started living for myself. I took a pottery class, joined a book club, and began planning that long-delayed European cruise. My body language changed entirely. My shoulders were back, my steps were lighter, and my eyes looked outward with renewed excitement. not inward with fear. The feeling was utterly satisfying and deserved. I taught them a hard, necessary lesson. I am not a resource to be depleted, nor a doormat to be trodden upon. I am an autonomous individual, and my boundaries are absolute. I had won my life back. This was the glorious, hard-earned freedom. The initial euphoria of victory and the clean, silent house eventually gave way to the quiet, profound turmoil of self-reflection. The legal battle was over, but the internal war raged on. Sitting alone in my immaculate living room, watching the sunset, I began to unpack the terrible question: how much of this was my fault? My facial expression often softened into a look of deep introspection, my eyes unfocused, staring into the middle distance as I replayed the entire trajectory of the relationship. I was consumed by a nagging Jiang-Sei internal conflict over the harshness of my response. The right and the wrong. On one hand, the decision to evict them to use the law was undeniably right. My safety was paramount. Daniel's violent act and Sarah's calculated manipulation crossed a line that, once breached, could never be uncrossed. I had to protect myself from abuse and financial predation. I was right to enforce my boundaries, to stand firm against entitlement. The feeling associated with this realization was a firm, self-protective resolve. I'd nod slightly, affirming the necessity of my actions. On the other hand, the emotion of a mother's failure was overwhelming. I raised Daniel. Did my overgiving, my constant striving for perfection and peace to avoid my own fears of abandonment, inadvertently breed his entitlement? Did I enable his dependence to the point where any failure to serve him triggered rage? The answer felt like a heavy stone in my chest. My hands would often rest on my knees, palms up, a gesture of emptiness. I felt an immense sadness, realizing my own emotional trauma. Section 3 had unconsciously influenced my parenting, making me prioritize his comfort over his character development. I was right to defend my home, but was I wrong to let the relationship deteriorate so far that eviction was the only solution? This realization brought a burning sense of shame and regret. I would pace slowly, my body moving with a heavy, thoughtful gait. I saw how my fear-driven need to be needed had made me blind to their growing disrespect, allowing it to fester until it exploded into violence. One moment I'd feel justified anger at Daniel's ingratitude. The next, a profound aching grief for the young loving boy he once was, and the mother-son bond I had irrevocably shattered. I understood that my victory was a necessary step for my survival, but it came at the cost of the single most important relationship in my life. This Jiang-Sei between self-preservation and maternal heartbreak was the true aftermath of the conflict, and it defined my ongoing internal struggle. The internal conflict was painful but necessary. It forced me to move past victimhood and self-pity into true personal growth. The core question became, how do I build a future where my boundaries are respected without repeating the mistakes of my past? What I learned. The greatest lesson was that boundaries are not barriers to love. They are prerequisites for healthy relationships. I finally understood that my previous attempts at harmony, built on constant self-sacrifice and avoidance of conflict, were actually toxic. By always giving in, always smoothing things over, I taught Daniel and Sarah that my needs were secondary and that my feelings didn't matter. I learned that my childhood trauma led me to confuse my desire to be needed with actual love. True love requires mutual respect, not constant service. My emotions shifted from regret to a calm acceptance. I realized I could be a loving mother without being a constant source of money and servitude. My facial expression softened with this realization. The tightness around my mouth, a permanent fixture of my worry, finally began to ease. What I decided to do to improve the relationship. The first decision was paradoxical, but essential. I chose a period of absolute zero contact. Improvement was impossible while the dynamic was still toxic. I blocked their calls and emails. This wasn't punishment. It was creating necessary distance to allow both sides to cool down and hopefully reflect. I wrote a letter to be held by my lawyer outlining that any future relationship would be governed by strict rules, professional communication only, no emotional demands, absolute respect for my property, and mandatory psychological counseling for Daniel to address his anger issues. My body language became more relaxed as I put this plan into place, feeling the physical weight of that unhealthy dependency lift. The goal wasn't immediate reconciliation, but establishing a framework for a different, healthier relationship, perhaps years down the line. I focused entirely on my own well-being, the flaw in my decision-making. Despite my growth, I recognized a significant flaw in my past decision-making, my reliance on financial control as a substitute for emotional connection. I now saw that the money I poured into Daniel, the house, the tuition, the debt relief was often used as a manipulative tool, a desperate attempt to buy his love and ensure his proximity. This created a profound sense of entitlement in him. When I finally cut the money, a necessary self-defense step, it wasn't seen as a boundary, but as a betrayal, escalating the conflict to violence. The key mistake was not setting emotional boundaries early on, failing to teach him accountability, and instead using money to paper over every problem. This oversight was deeply rooted in my fear of abandonment. If I had been confident enough in my own worth, I would have allowed him to face the consequences of his own choices much earlier, fostering resilience instead of entitlement. My eyes would cloud with a brief, genuine sorrow when I thought of this, acknowledging that I was an unwitting participant in enabling his worst behavior, driven by my own trauma. This acknowledgement was the final, hardest step in my journey toward true freedom and accountability for my part in the dynamic. Now, sitting here in my quiet home, having successfully defended my physical and financial safety, I want to talk directly to all of you watching in America, especially those over 30 who are navigating the complexities of family money and personal respect. My story is not just about a saltless soup. It's a cautionary tale about what happens when you lose yourself inside a relationship. The first crucial lesson is about empathy, but not in the way you might think. Yes, I deserved empathy as the victim, but I had to find a sliver of understanding for Daniel, not to excuse his behavior, but to free myself from the constant cycle of hatred. I realized Daniel's entitlement stemmed from my own overparenting, a legacy of trauma that often repeats itself. When you refuse to acknowledge the why behind the conflict, you are doomed to replay the drama. I'm talking about empathetic accountability. Daniel grew up believing the world, and specifically his mother, owed him comfort and ease. When that expectation was violated by the forgotten salt, his only response was disproportionate, primitive rage. Understanding this was not about forgiving the slap. It was about acknowledging my role in enabling the entitlement. It allowed my emotions to move from pure anger to a complicated, sad realization of a generational failure. To the audience, I urge you, look beyond the surface rage. What emotional debt or dependency have you unintentionally fostered in your loved ones? Empathy must be paired with firm boundaries. My second most vital message is about boundaries. I spent 60 years confusing kindness with martyrdom. Boundaries are the invisible property lines that define where you end and they begin. In my case, I let Daniel and Sarah move in rent-free, cover my expenses, and dictate my schedule, all because I was terrified of being alone. The moment I established a boundary, you must respect me or you must leave, was the moment the conflict exploded. But that explosion was necessary. Boundaries are often tested violently by those who benefited most from their absence. For the audience, set your boundaries before you are forced to set them in court. Define what is acceptable communication, financial expectation, and physical respect now. Don't wait for the metaphorical no-salt moment to become a physical assault. My hands are now used for painting and creating, not constantly serving or defensively bracing against emotional blows. That physical shift reflects the internal peace of having firm lines. Finally, we must talk about communication. My past communication style was passive-aggressive kindness. I used cooking and cleaning as silent gestures of love, hoping they would intuitively understand my needs. This is a common trap, especially for women of my generation. True healthy communication is clear, direct, and non-negotiable. I should have said, "Daniel, I love having you here, but we need a formal agreement outlining rent and chores," instead of just doing everything quietly. My final most effective communication was the eviction notice, a formal legal document that left no room for interpretation. While extreme, it proved the power of clarity. For you, the viewer, remember, say what you mean what you say, and don't let a fear of confrontation allow resentment to boil over. I learned that a moment of awkward, difficult conversation is infinitely better than years of silent servitude, followed by legal warfare. Live your life with clear intentions and demand the respect you deserve, because no amount of money, service, or silent sacrifice can buy genuine love. So that is the story of the saltless soup that cost me a son but saved my life. I hope my journey from fearful catering mother to a woman who decisively stood up for herself provides some light for your own path. It's easy to judge Daniel and Sarah's actions, but I urge you to look inward. Are you sacrificing your safety or sanity for the sake of manufactured peace? Are you enabling entitlement out of a deep-seated fear of being alone? Take a moment right now and think about the one boundary you need to set this week. Don't wait for your own breaking point. If my story resonated with you, if you've ever had to fight for your place in your own family, please hit the like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear this message about boundaries. I want to know your thoughts. Comment below and tell me, what was the moment you realized you had to change the dynamic with your adult children or in-laws? What step did you take to reclaim your life? I'll be reading your responses. And finally, subscribe to my channel. This is just the beginning of Eleanor Vance's next chapter. The fight was hard, but the freedom is extraordinary. Join me next time when I discuss how I learned to navigate the holidays alone for the first time, and how I actually found joy in the quiet. Thank you for watching, and remember, your peace is worth fighting for.